Appendix C. Glossary. Acid Bessemer. Steel made from the Bessemer process of furnace having an acid lining, usually ganistered other than highly silicous material. Phosphorus and sulfur are not removed from the refining process. Acid open hearth. Steel made from open hearth process in a furnace lined with acid silicous material because of the character of furnaces. An acid slag must be employed by refining of the bath in the process. Since the forests of sulfur are not removed as acid steel making process, the metallic charge must be made up of net specifically selected pig iron and scrap. Adzing machine, portable power operated machinery designated to adze the rail seat of the ties to provide the proper bearing for the rail or the tie plates. Alignment of the horizontal location of the railroad described by the curves and tangents. Anti-splitting iron is a piece of steel strip beveled in both sides at one edge of the bent to the desired shape of the application, driven into the end of the cross section of the tie. Timber of the control of the splitting. Asphalt of the cement of flux unfluctuated asphalt. Thick material, especially prepared as quality of consistency suitable for the direct and the manufacturers of all sphatic materials having penetration between 5 and 250. The ballast is selected material placed on the roadbed purpose of holding the track in line and surface. The ballast of the curb is longitude timber and placed in the outer edge of the floor of the ballast deck. Bridges of the retaining ballast better than the deformation of surface head of the rail immediately in vicinity of the end. The deviation of the vertical upright members of the trestle of the bent. The batter pile, one driven of the inclination resist force, which are not vertical bent. The group of bent members forming a single vertical support of the trestle, designed as a pile. A bent in principal members of the piles as frame bent, wherein the frame timbers berm a space left between the top of the toe of the slope of the excavation made for the intercepting ditches of bower pits, and an approximate horizontal space introduced in slope. Bending in stone, brick masonry, mechanical dispositions of stone, brick, and other building blocks is overlapping the breaking joint. See English bond and Flemish bond. Borrow all material used in making embankments in which does not outcome necessarily excavation. Borrow pit excavation made of the purpose of obtaining the embankment material. Branch line, secondary line of lines of railway, branding, identification markings, hot rolled rail, raised figures and letters in rail, and web indicating the weight of the rail section, number, type of the rail, kind of steel, name of the manufacturer, mill and year, the month enrolled. Bridge and tie, transverse timber resting on the stringers of supporting of the rail, broken base, any break in the base of the rail, brush the trees less than 4 inches of the stump top. Diameter of the shrubs, branches, the trees that have been cut off. Bulkhead, a structure of preventing sliding of natural grade around and filling the material into the water, or limiting wall and structures along the waterfront. Bulkhead, a timbers placed against the embankment of side of the trestle bent and retained in the embankment. Burrs, the rough edge of the left at the end of the rail, installed and on the side of the web weld when drilling in the bolt holes. Camber, a slight convexity built into a span of counteracting sag, resulting in elastic deflection. Cant, an inward inclination of the rail affected in use of inclined surface tie plates, usually expressed as the right of inclination, such as 1 and 4, etc. Cap, the horizontal member of the tie plates, or the horizontal member of top piles of posts connecting them from a bent. Cap, stringer, and strap, a piece of round, square, structural strap, shape of the two iron steel and straight in the bent, and used in the fastening. Stringers and cap means of horizontal bolts, and within the use of drift bolt. Car, retarded, a braking device, usually power operated bolt, are built in the railway track, reduced to speed cars, means of brake shoes, which are in the make braking position, pressing against the side of the lower portions of the wheel. Cast iron, always of the iron containing 1/7, 4/5 a percentage of carbon cast, usually not applicable, malleable at any temperatures. Cinders refuse residue from the coal burned in locomotives other than furnace. Closure of the rail between the parts of any special track work. Lay out the rails between the switches and the frog of the turnout, sometimes called in the lead rails. lead rails, connection rails, also connecting the frog and crossing the adjacent crossing, no form, but not forming parts thereof. Compound fissure, the progressive fracture organization of the horizontal split head, in which in the turns up and down in the rail as smooth as bright and surfaces in progression substantially at the right angle to the length of the right. Compound fissures require examination of both faces and fractures to locate the horizontal split of the head, which they originate. Comprehensive strength, the maximum comprehensive stress within the material capable of sustaining compromising joint bar. A joint bar is designed to connect to the rails different in the fishing heights of sections of rails within the same section but different from the joint drillings. Compromising joint rail, a joint that uniting the butting end of the continuous rail differs in sections of rails in the same section of different joint drillings. Continuous weld rail, a number of rails welded together in lengths of 400 feet or longer as soon as welded rail. Contract, a written agreement between two or more parties specifying terms and conditions, and under the certain obligations must be performed. Specification of the part of the contract. Conventional sign of symbol such as mark and character, abbreviation, letter selected, a sanction, general agreement, common and indicated map plan at certain forms, conditions, objects more than national in structure, corrosion of and dissolving and eating away the surface of the metal through the chemical action of the regularity, slow as rusting, is irregular, rapidly pitting and grooving of the interior boilers, corrugated rail, rough condition on the rail tread, alternated ridges and grooves which develops in the surface, a coupler device which any of the machines can be towed connected to the towing agency. A coupler includes a draw head and coupler links and pins and other devices connecting the two draw heads. A coupler draw bar, the portion of the coupler that is that used to connect the draw heads to the two cars other than unite on the roadway machineries. Coupler draw head, the portion of a coupler is rigidly attached to the motor car trailer and into the roadway machinery designed to be towed. Cressetone, used as a preserving cressetone, distillated of coal tar, producing high temperatures, carbonization, emitted coal in continuous pure unsensible liquidity or aromatic hydrocarbon, contains applicable quantities of tar acid and tar bases, is heavier than water and heavy, has continuous boiling ranges at least 125 degrees Celsius, being at 20 to 200 degrees Celsius. Crop ended at the piece of cut from the end of the loom of the rail from during the manufacturing. Crossing track, structure used where the one track contains another grade and consistent with four connected frogs. Bolted rail and a crossing in which all the running surfaces are rolled and railed and the parts being held together within the bolts. Magnesium steel insert, a crossing in which a magnesium steel casting inserted into four intersections being fitted into rolled rails, forming these points and wings and crossing frogs. Solid magnesium, a crossing in which the frogs are solid magnesium steel type. Movable point, a crossing small angle in which two center of the frogs consists of a knuckle rail and two opposed movable center points within the necessary fixtures. Single rail crossing in which the connections between the end of the frogs and the center of frogs consist of running rails. Only two rails crossing in which the connections between the end of the frogs and center frogs consist of running rails and guard rails. Three rails crossing in which there are connections between the frogs at the center and the consisting of the running rails, guard rails, and easer rails. The crossing plates interposed with the crossing and the ties and other timbers protecting the ties better than crossing. The distributing load of large areas for names, a description of various types to see the plan basics number 700D in the portfolio of track work plans. Center frogs, the two frogs are opposite ends of the short diagonal crossing end of the frog. The two frogs opposite ends of the longitude or long diagonal of the crossing. Knuckle rail or bent rail, equivalent of structure forming in the obtuse point against the movable center point of the removable crossing and slip switch, and rests when set in traffic. Movable center post and one of the movable tapped and movable point of crossing on the slip switch. Running rail and the running rail in which the treaded on the wheel bar crossing over the turnouts of the track between the range and form the continuous passage through the nearby generally parallel tracks. movable center point. One of the movable tapped and movable point crossings, a slip switch. Running rail surfaces and tread on the wheel bars, crossing over the turnouts of the track between the frogs arranged and form a continuous passage between the nearby generally parallel tracks. Double the two crossovers that intersect between the connection tracks. Cross section, a vertical section of the ground of the right angles to the center line of the crosshead of the flattening and crushing down in the head of the rail curve compound. And the continuous change in direction and alignment means of two is more continuous simple curves, different degrees of having common tangent of their junction points, degree of the angle subtended in the center of the simple curve of 100-foot chord chord. Easement, a curve of degree of various uniform and definitely determined manner of the gradual transition of tangent and simple curve and the connections between the two simple curves. Versus two contingent simple curves in opposite directions within a common tangent as in the junction point. Simple, a continuous change in direction lies and means of a single radius. Vertical, easement in the track to connect, intersect, and grading lines. Curved lead, distance between the actual point of the switch and one half or a half inch of the point of the frog measured of the outside gauge line in the turnout. Damaged rail, any rail broken, injured, wrecks broken, flat, unbalancing wheels, slipping or similar causes. Dating nail, a nail with head heaving, raised, depressed, number and symbol within which is driven in the longitude surface of pole, tie, timber, and identifying the year in which the material was treated. Decay, disintegration, wood substance, and due to the action of destroying the fungi, depth of the ballast distance from the bottom of the type of the subgrade. Derail, the track structure to the derailing stock in case of the emergency. C, and also switch point derail. Detail, fracture, progressive fracture, originating at or near the surface of the rail. These structure fractures shouldn't be confused in transverse fissures and compound fissures and the defects of internal organs, and detail fractures and having origins following in the type of defects and progress crosswise into the head of the rail shell. Within the shell, the metal becomes separated for the head, usually at the gauge of the core. Head checks usually is the close gauge of the movement of the flow of the surface metal, insufficient to a start of the hairline crack. Diesel, see the engine's deck, and natural, artificial, and inlet or basin boats, including both of the water protecting sides, the structural against the water, which of the bolts of discharge and cargo's passenger siminis with a wharf or used by very generally Great Lakes. Driven bolt, drift bolt, a piece of round or squared bar within without head of the point of the specified length, driven as a spike. Electrolysis, the process wherein electric current passing through the electrode or vice versa causes electric change that causes electrolyte. Electrolysis is also the process of decomposition which is aided in the passage of the electric current. Elevation of the curves, the super evaluation of the vertical distance out of the rail, and the inner rail, the embankment of the fill, the embankment of the earth or the other material constructed above the natural ground surfaces, and shipping, the loosening of the metal of the top gauge side of the end of the rail, and the hardening and heat treatment of the top portion of the heads of the rails, and the minimizing the rail batter. End of the overflow or projection of metal into the joint, a gap at the top and side of the head of the rail. Engine burn and fracture, progressive fracture originating in the spots where driven and having spilled in the railhead and developing downward, and frequently reassemble the compound over even transversal fissures of which they should not be confused or classified. Equipment, motive power over the rolling stock, floating equipment, highway vehicles in use in transportation services, facilities and properly physicals and distinctive cable rendering and specific services, fastening joint bars and bolts and spikes, auxiliary not lock spring washers, plates, rail braces, anti-creep devices, fishing spaces, the space between the head of the bay so the rail occupied on the joint bar, fish plate, a short plate piece of joint and secured inside in two members and connecting them into the end to end. The flare, a tapered widening flangeway in the end of the guard line of a track structure, at the end of the guardrail, at the end of the frog, and crossing the wing of the rail. Opening in the distance between the gauge of lining guardrail to the truck structure and the wider end of the flare. The flange way, the opening way through the truck structure within the passageway for the wheel flanges. The depth of the wheel flange is passage for the vertical distance from the top of the tread surface of the top of the filter and separator introduced between the tread of the portion and the guard portion of the track structure, with the distance between the gauge line and the guard line of the track structure, which provides the passage wheel of the flangeway, flowed and heated and railing out of the metal of the head of the railway toward the sides without showing the indication of a breaking down of the headed structure. Footing is structural unit and distribute the wall common loads the foundation material. Foundation material including piling and other special instructions which support the structures its load, frame, trestles, a structure in which the upright members are supported and frame timbers, a track structure used an intersection of two running rails, providing support running wheels and passages. Their flanges and other permeating wheels of either rail to cross the other. Bolted rigid frog built essentially rolled and within fillers between the rails and held together within the bolts. For the names, details, parts, and plan, basic number 390 in the portfolio track work plans. Spring rail, a frog having a movable winging. Spring rail, frog having a movable wing rail normally headed on a point of the rail, and this making up broken running surfaces of wheels using in one track where as the flanges, wheels, and other tracks forces movable wing railway into the point rail to provide a passageway. Spring rail right-handed or left-handed standing on the toe in the spring rail of the front frog looking toward its point in the right hand, and the movable wing rail located on the right hand side of the left hand frog and the movable wing located on the left hand side. Rail-bound magnesium, a frog consisting essentially of the magnesium steel body casting fitted with the bolt between the rolled rails and held together into the bolts. Self-magnesium steel, a free consisting essential of single magnesium steel casting, self-guarded flange flangeway, a frog provided in guides of flangeways above it and running surface in contact, and tread rims and wheels and purpose of safely guarding the flanges at the point of the frog. Clamp, a frog built essentially rolled within the fillers of the rails held together in the clamps. Angle, the angle formed by the intersecting lines of the frog. Number, one half of the contingent of the one half of the frog angle. Number of the units center line in which the spread is in 1 unit. Point, the part of the frog lying in the gauge line extending from the intersection toward the heel of the end. The theoretical point of the intersection of the gauge lines of the frog. Half-inch, a point located in the distance between theoretical point toward the heel equal to inches and 1/2 of the frog, which is spread between the gauge lines of 1.5. Is original from which his measurement are usually made. Guard, the point in mid-guardly introduced extended for the portion of the frog. Hail ended in the end of the frog, which is in the farther from the switch and which has both of the points of the rail other than running surface between the gauge lines. Heel length and distance between the heel and end of the half-inch point of the frog measured below along the gauge lines. Heel spread, the distance between the gauge lines and the heel of the frog. Thread of the point of the throat of the point of which converging wings are frog closest together. The end of the frog in which the nearer the switch of which has both gauge lines between the wing of the rails and running surfaces. Toe length, distance between the toe and the other half-inches of the frog measured along the gauge line. Toe spread, distance between the gauge line and the toe end of the frog. Wing well rises raised in portions of the top surfaces wings of the frogs. More practically, when over the magnesium steel design directly opposite the point gradually sloping down in general level with running surfaces, therefore providing additional metal to those parts of the frog, usually the wear out of the first, and also making a transverse contour conforming more closely to that than treaded of a tapered wheel. Gauge track tool, a device in which the gauge of the track establishes a measured gauge of the track distance between the gauge line measured of the right angles thereto, the standard gauge, and 4 feet 1/8 inches. A gauge line 5/8 inches below the top of the center head of the running rail, corresponding location of the tread of the portion of the other track structures, the side which is the nearest of the center track, gauging and the work done of the rail at the straightening of the press of the steel gauge tool for the purpose of taking out the bend, the grade. Now, in the ratio fall out of the grade line in the length, and note that the term of the grade is sometimes designated the finished roadbed, and but such use of conflicts, meaning of the grade is given above, and it should be not used. The grade verb, the prepare around the reception of the ballast and the track, the grade line, the line of the profile, representing the embankments of the bottom of the cuttings to receive the ballast intersections in the plane roadbed of the vertical plane through the center block line, the great inclination of the grade line horizontally in cross tie, which is the machine of the gouge depression of across the tip, and which is the ribs of the bottom of the tie plate may fit the grout in the fixture mixture of the cement, water, and cement and sand and water and other within a mixture guard line along with the side of the flangeway is near the center of the track and the same elevation as the gauge line. Guard is checkage gauge. The distance between the guard line and measured across the track right angles are the gauge lines. Guard face gauge and distance between the guard rays measured across the track at the right angles in the gauge line. The guard rail, a rail other than structure laid in the parallel running rails and track to prevent from wheels from which is railed and heels and corrective alignment to prevent their flat striking points, turnout and crossing flags of the point switches and rail other than the struck laid and within the running rails of the track keep the derailed where wheels are adjacent to the running rails. Frog, a rail other than the device guide of the wheel flange is kept at the clear point of the frog. The switch, a rail other than structure laid parallel running rail ahead of the split switch forming the flangeway of the running rail to hold the wheels of the rolling stock to the correct alignment when approaching a switch. One piece of guard rail consists of a single complete, either fabricated or other designated. No auxiliary parts or fastening other than spikes required for its installation. Adjustments separated the middle block of two more parts, acting as a filler between the running rail and guarded rail, and so designed and provided varying widths of flangeway braces. The metal shape designed to fit the contour side of the guard rail and extended out of the tie, and provisioned fastening therefore to restrain the moving and tilting of the guard rail away from the running rail. Braces adjusted in the guard rail brace switching made bilaterally within the respect of the rail and distance between the guard rail running rail. Clamp, a device consisting of the yoke fastening to engage the running of the rail and guard rail and holding them to the correct relation to each other, and guard timber, longitude timber placed outside the track rail to maintain the spacing of the tie. Hammer blow, a periodical vertical force due to central fugal forces of unbalanced parts of revolving drivers of the locomotive. Harbor line, inner and outer, and the inner and the lines define the limits of the port and the heaven regarding the inner best protected areas, outer less than protected off, and often referred to port of the regulations, and center of the location of country. Inner harbor line of the assignment, cinemas bulkhead in the outer harbor line within the pier headline. The hardness of physical property within the enabled material to resist the indentation of the abrasion. A hardwood, one of the group of trees which in the break leaves of the term references the head of the hardness of wood. Hollow, the distance grading material is in moved in construction of the roadway. Heartwood of the core of the tree trunk comprising annual rings containing non-living elements, usually dark, and the sapwood heat in the melting steel resulting from one charge of the melting surface. Helper stringer and added to any existing panel stringers. Horizontal split head, horizontal progressive defective originating inside of the railhead within usually 1.5 inch more than below running surfaces, and progressive horizontal all directions generally accompanied by flat spot running surface defective appears of crack lengths of rails, and when it reaches the sides of the railhead, see the compound fissures and hot-bedded in series sides of the rails, placed it on cooling and rolling, selling and camber, hydraulic grade line and lining and joining the point to which water flowing within the pipeline is measured will rise in various points of atmospheric pressure. Impervious, the quality of being completely resistant to the penetration by the water of the other liquid. An inclined tract and their support structure leading to the adjustable apron and bridge and transfer bridge and at a transfer slip. Ingot, a special form of casting poured from the direct teaming ladle of subsequently rolling and forging. Bled, an ingot of the falling over solidify that has made a mishap or other liquid interior escaping from leaving walls intact may be bled to at the top of the bottom button, usually at the bottom. The butt and it's short and got, and usually in the last one's poured at the heat, which is not sufficient steel to fill the mold. The lower end of the ingot, sometimes of the butt out of the ingot, hot top and sink head. At the top of the type of the ingot is molded, and the top of the extent of the refractory non-conducting material designed to minimize the piping within the ingot proper. Ingot molded. Cast metal therefore is square rectangular in section and usually 6 feet more than height, in which is molten steel is poured and steamed in purpose of solidification. Molded in rosettes and cased like a metal stool base mounted on the buggy of a transfer stripper and soaking pits. Ingot stool, the plate of the base in which the open bottom of the ingot mold and stands. Inner guardrail, longitude members, and usually metal rail secured only to the top of the ties inside the track trailer to guide the derail cars. Installation of devices material that has been prevented of the following electrical current in a track circuit in the passing of the one rail to the other, and switches and other than tracks. Structures, an intake of this portion of other the pipe and apparatus through the which water enters the source supply, and such as the end and intake of structure built into the body of water purpose in providing place from which is the water that pumped without interruption. Interplace ditch, an opening artificial waterway diverting surface from the water of natural course of flow. Intermediate sill, a horizontal member is placed in the trestle bent from the cap of the lower section sill of the upper section. The inner concave surface of the arc. An inventory list of details of land, road, and equipment compromising physical property of the carrier of the evaluation. Inventory verb and acting count of computation, compiling record fixed and movable property of the railway. Joint bar hat fastening designed a unit of the abutting ends of the contiguous rail. Insulated rail joint designated to arrest the following electrical current from the rail to the rail means of installation placed as separate to the rail ends other than metal parts and connecting them. In joint bar, steel member embodying the strength and stiffness and structural shape of material commonly used in pairs and purposing joining rail ends and together and holding them accurately, evenly, and firmly in position and reference and surface and gauge and slide alignment. Joint, the distance between the ends of continuous rail and track measured at 0.58 of an inch below the top of the rail outside of the head. Ladle test point testing got in a small casting made in team to be used by chemical test pay purposes. Lap, a surface of defective metal appearing as in the seam, a cause and folding over the height of the metal, and in the sharp corners then rolling. They must not be welded surface them into surfaces. Lead the difference in the distance between the actual point of the switch, half inch of the frog, and see the plans on number 910, 920 of the portfolio track plans. The length of the actual point of the switch of the half-inch point of the frog measured of the line of the parent track covered, and distance between the actual point of the switch and half-inch point of the frog measured outside of the gauge and lined and turnout. Theoretical distance from the theoretical point of the uniform turnout over the curvature of the theoretical point of the frog measured over the line of the parent lead of the curve. The curve is in the curve turnout to interpose in between the switching frog. Level, the condition of the track in which elevation of the two rails transversely the same. The line of the condition of the track regardless of the uniform direction of the short distances on the tangent uniformly variation direction over the short distances of the curves lining track, shifting the track of laterally conforming the established alignment, location established and pushing position of the center line of the grade line of the railroad preparatorily into its construction, longitudinally struck to the grit and stiffening member of the running horizontal nearly so they bent to bank. Longitude X brace is a member extending diagonally from the bent and vertical battered place. Main line, the principal lines of railway main track is extending from the yards between the stations and upon which trains are operated on a table of train in order for the use of governor and block signals in track structure having fixed and movable point of the opposite side of the track of the tongue switch as it is Companioning place A mate is termed an outside and inside, depending on whether it is in place and outside and inside of the curve. And inside mate being comparatively little used. Mattress, a strong mat containing various materials bound and woven and used for protection of the surface eroding banks bottom of an alluvial river. A ballast and stone and riprap placed in any wood of the mattress to sink to become conform to the riverbed. Brushes and wire envelope. Brush laid to two layers between the woven wire netting and which and tied together in bottom of the netting envelope parallel to the bank and top of the bank. Bottom brushes layers normal to the bank of the top parallel. Milling and rail, the cutting of the ends of the rails of the milling hob eliminate the roughness and accuracy, sawing modulus elasticity, the ratio within the elastic limit of the material of the unit of stress corresponding in the unit. Strain and deformation, the mud sill and subsill are timber embedded in ground to support the frame bent. Normalized heating. Iron-based alloys are approximately 100 degrees Fahrenheit above critical temperature range, followed in cooling below the range in still air or ordinary temperature, noticing a transversing and horizontal motion of the locomotive exerts the lateral forces of the supporting structures. Open hearth furnaces. A rectangular furnace is the bulk brick line in which basic materials having heard on the metal, generally open exposed and action burning gates. Open hearth process conversion of solid pig of the addition iron of steel crap and through exposure of burning gases of reverberated furnacing and refining of the molten metal of the carbon generally reducing considerably below the personnel ultimately required for the metal, therefore carburized and usually additionized into magnesium and silicon as they are made. Ordinarily, they break the single angular break arming or any partial complete fracture in which there are no signs of fissures and in which there are no other defects and damages visible. Out of face refer to the referring to track work, whether the procedure is completely continuously over a single piece of track distinguished from the work as disconnected in points only. Pass in the passage of any pace of metal through the roller of rolling, milling, and ingoting from the blooming of the rolls, or opening various rolls and roll trains when have given the hot metal desired shape, persoloading in the act of water descending in the earth and the ground surface, permanent set of the strains and deformation remaining in a body after being stressed beyond the elastic limit, and pig iron, the product of either cast or in molten state, resulting in heating iron or Lyman stating coke together in blast furnace after removal from the molten impurities of slag. Pig iron contains a high percentage of carbon ranging from 3 to 4%. The pile of a member usually driven and jetted into the ground, arriving in the support of the underlying strata and friction in the ground and the friction. Usually the functions of the pile are the carry the supposed loaded into two, compact the surrounding ground, two, form the wall to the exclude the wall, water soft material to resist the lateral pressure of adjacent grounds, bearing one used of superimposed loaded and large and end of the pile, foot of the pile, lower end of the pile, head of the pile, upper end of the pile, tip of the pile, smaller end of the pile, and cap and hood of the bonnet, block used and protect the head of the pile and hold it into the lead during the driving. The pile driver, a machine in the driving piles, a pile hammer, a weight used to drive piles into the designated steam hammer, diesel hammer, and dropper upper hammer, depending on the source of energy. Pile trestles, trucks in which it operates and supports its piles, pile railed, piles are anchored, and piles are driven in a landslide bulkhead prior to the bulkhead pier and anchored into the tie rods, cables, and chains, and other devices, pipe, railed, and other vertical splits, usually in the web due to the vertical size of the shrinkage cavity and gotten in a unite of rolling. The formation of a cavity of the upper interior indigotten and causing shrinkage and liquid of the metal solidify, localize, and corrosion. A platform on which the freight baggage and mail expresses and handled on from the end of the cars. The high platform An near car floor evaluation. A low platform is a platform near the top of the rail. The elevation of the plug tie is a rectangular section of the wood shaped and somewhat like spikes driven into the holes. The spikes have been withdrawn post. One of the vertical battered members is bent into the frame trestles profile. A line representing ground surface established in grade line both in relation to the horizontal. A rail saw power machine provided with a saw, either the tooth friction type or used in cutted steel saws. Rail section shape of the end of the rail cut on a rail. The shape of the end rail cut on the rail angles of the rail mills and identifying the different shapes and types of rails and code numbers. And for example, 132.28 and 133.31 RE rail in sections, rail tracked and rolled, steel shaped, and commonly T section designated and laid onto the end two parallel lines and cross ties and other unsuitable supports for the track for the rolling rocks stock. Grid of the C plans basic section. Basic number 1002, 1003 in portfolio track work plans. See the plan basic number 1000 in portfolio track work and plans. Heavy rails is used in the portfolio. The section weighing over the 110 per pound. Medium weight rails and used in portfolio whether the section is weighing 80 to 110 pounds per yard, including railway track spaces. A scale especially designed for weighing rail equipment. Retarded car or braking device, usually power operated bolt built in the railway track to reduce the speed of the cars or means of brake shoes which in set the section position set against the side of the lower portions of the wheels. Retarded in an air the braking device without external power built in the railway track reduces the speed of the cars means of brake shoes. The side of the lower portion of the wheels is sometimes provided meaning when operating nullified in braking effect. Right away. The lands of rights to use be held in rail their operation. Roadbed shoulders, portion of the sublighting between the ballast covered portion, ditch and cuts and top of the slope and embankments. Roadway signs, any marker displayed near the right of way of instruction informing information of the employees or others running rail, the rail surfaces on which they tread. The wheelbarrows run off when applied the part of the precipitation which is carried off from the land upon the falls. Sash brace, a horizontal member secured to the piles and bent score mark incision of longitude surface hewed and resulting in stroke of the axle used in manufacture. Segregation positive concentration of carbon impurities during the solidification of the part of the ingot other than casting and solidifies and lasts. The condition existing is where any of the part ingot and casting and less than the average amount of carbon impurities. Self-guard frog, flange frog, a frog provided the guides and flanges above its running surfaces, the contact tread and rims and wheels, and the purpose of safely guiding the flanges and past the point of the frog. The settlement of the noun. The term settlement is applied to the grading materials, reduction, elevation of the embankment caused by shrinkage and subsidence, shatter, creaks, 1 minute, and cracks in interior railheads seldom closer than 1/2 an inch of sulfur visible offer only after deep etching in high magnification. They may extend by any direction. They are caused by rapid air condition. Many be prevented forming, cooling and rails shattered, cracks, and also occurring in other steel products. Sheet piles driven in close contact in order to provide the tight wall to prevent the leakage of water and materials, and driven to resist the lateral pressure of the adjacent ground. Shims, a small piece of wood metal and placed between the two members of structure to bring them into desired relative elevation. A metal protection of the point of the front of the foot of the pile, the shoulder, the portion of the ballast between the end of the tie and the toe of the ballast. Slope, shrinkage, noun. The term the shrinkage is applied to the ground, applying to the difference in volume of the material excavated. Ultimate volume of the same material embankment. It has reached a state equilibrium when later it is smaller. The shrinkage allowance is excessive length of which a hot rail is cut and leaving the rolls to allow the shrinkage of required length in which when cold siding the track auxiliary to the main trackage for the meeting and passing the train still the lowest horizontal member of the frame bent skew the having access to any other angle than right. Angle of the angle deviation of one another in 2-inch section of the right angle to the other side. A superficial gravitational earth movement. Slip and switch double. A combination of crossing two right hands and two left hand. Switch curves in between them within the limits of crossing, connecting in two intersection tracks, both side and crossing within the use of other separated turnout track frogs and combination of crossing within the right-handed left-handed switch and curve between within the limits of the crossing connection of the two intersections without the use of separate turnout frog slope and incline with the cutting or embankment slope stakes shakes the indicating top of the bottom of the slope snow sweeper and equipped with the brushes rails necessary machinery revolve them and use them for sweeping the snow and of the rails. Soaking pit, a vertical reheating furnace is which in the gotten is be stripped and placed upright in position purposely a uniform reheating to the unit temperature required. Rolling special track work, all rails track and structures fitting is another plane ungirded and track on neither curved or fabricated laying specification the parts of the contract describing the materials and details of the construction spiral when using the respective track a formal easement curve in which the change of degree is uniform throughout the length. The 10 chord approximately spiral measured in 10 equal chords whose change in degree of curve is proportional to the length measured along the spiral, such as chord splice drilling and spacing in the holes and ends of the rails of the track structures, receiving in the bolts of the fastening of the joint bars, split web in the longitude, diagonal, transversal crack of the web or the rail. The spot board is slight, highly placed above the cross of the track and proposed height of the indicating new surface. Ensure the uniformity spring washer member designated prevented backward movement and the nut loosening bolted members of the rail joint due to the wear of stretched rods, other deterioration. Stamping the figures intended after a hot saw in center of the railway parallel direction of the rolling indication of the C heat numbered and gotten number of the cast rolled in one letter designation of the position of each rail that references the top of the ingotten steel. The furious material produced in fluid condition, usually the Beesmere open-hearted electric furnace and basic oxygen process, particularly the free from the slag, distinguish it from the wrought iron in general, contains less than 1/7/10% of carbon distinguishation in a cast from cast iron. Stock guarded barrier ward of metal and material placed in the between alongside of the track rails and prevented passages livestock along the railroad track of the tracks. The stock rail running rail against which the switch rail operates. Stock rail bended to bend site in which it must be given in the stock rail at the vertex of the switch to allow it to follow the gauge line of the turnout. Stress is the subsource forces acting in the interior of the body with which resist external forces tending to change the form or shape. The stress is measured in the forces per unit area per square inch. So kilograms are used per square military or millimeter, etc. Stringer longitude member extending the bent from the bent supporting the track. Subballast material is superior in character. Spread of the finished subgrade in the roadbed below the top of the ballast provide it better than drainage, preventing the upheaval and the frost from better distributed load over the roadbed. Subdrain covered drain below the roadbed. Grounded surfaces receiving the water along the length of its proportions of its joint. Subgraded and now and finished surfaces of the roadbed, ballast and track. Subsidence now in the portion of any embankment has been settled in below the original surfaces of the ground. Subsurface damage the control of removal or excess the moisture contained in the soil. Surface track the condition of the track of vertical evenness and smoothness running in the tread to the top part of the track structures on which the treads of the wheelbarrows sway. Braces a member bolted and spiked and bent and extended diagonally across the face. Sweep rail the two flexible attached to front and tanker car. The location brushes the rail and the car moves in the forward easily. Remove all obstruction for the top of the rail. The term swell applied for the grading material differences in the volume. Same material embankment after there has been reached and the state of equilibrium with later is greater. Switch is the truck structure and used in diverting rolling stock from one track from the other. The split is continuously essential for the two movable point of the rails necessary fixtures and split in the uniform riser, the switch of the rails, and the uniforms elevation of the riser and the plate's entire length of the switch, therefore not of, and the heel slope of the point of the rail rise will run off back in the switch's enclosure, split off the graduate rails and split off and switch rails are gradually elevated, means a graduated riser when until the required height above the stock rail, therefore having heel slope, split of the magnesium tip, and split width switch in which the head of both of the switches rails and cut out of each of the portion in the magnesium steel place fastened in the rail into the form of the point, split insulated switch in which the principal gauge pages switch rods connecting the reaching of one rail opposite of the rail are provided installation so that the electrical track circuit will not be shunted in spring. A switch in the operation mechanism is incorporated in the spring device arranged as it is automatically returned to the parts original normal position after that they have been thrown to the flanges for trailing wheels and passing along with other track that they have points of the facing movement tongue. The switch plates are consisting essential of movable tub within suitable enclosed and supporting body and structures designated for one side of the track, while on the other side there is use for the mate other than another tongue switch. Untongued switch is termed inside or outside, depending on whether it is placed on the inside or outside of the curve. The outside of the tongue and switch and comparatively lightly used. Angled when included between the gauge line and the switch rail is pointed at the stock rail. The detector bar, the strip of the metal mounted alongside the tracker and rail and connected in the throwing mechanism of the switch prevented the moving and switch under the frame. Under the trains, head separation of the point of switch and rails, which in the head of the rail attains in the full width. Hail with the end of the switch of the rail which is in the farther from the point of near the frog. Heel the spread, the distance from the heel between the gauge of the switch rails gauge and the line and stock rails that is between the standardized 6¼ inches of the straight switches. Heel slope inclination of produced gradual rated risers and parts of the switches and reduce the elevation as the height of the riser decreases toward the heel of the switches. Point of the actual end of the switch of the rail farther from the frog, the point of the spread of the gauge line and stock rails and switch rails. Sufficient and practical switch points. Point of the three radical vertexes, the point and where the gauge line of the switch rails and produced wood intersects the gauge line and stock rail. Point of the rail and switch rails and switch point and the type of rail and split switch. Point of the rail. Point of the rise and the elevation of the switch rail to allow the overcharging part of the hollowed out treads to the worn to pass over the stock rail. Planning and bottom of the out plane at an angle at the bottom of the base, the switch rails and the point and toward the heel allow the switch rail and to the rest of the top of the base and stock rail when the switch is closed. Planning the side and cuts and made be the side of the head of the switch rails from the form of the tampering. Planning the top, the cutout made of the top of the head switch rails to the point approximately head separation. Planning chamfer cut in the vertical beveling and gauge side of the switch point to produce the sharp edge as to prevent the wheel flange and striking the point. In rail base, the metal shape designed to fit the contour of the side of the stock rail by extending the switch provisions and fastening of the plate to the tie and restraint of the movement of the stock rail. The rail brake adjustment, in which the adjustment laterally respects the stock rail, compensates the variation disposition rail to permit the adjustment of the rail, where to throw off the distance from that which the point switch of the rails moved in sideways and measured along the center line of number 1 switch rod and head rod. This distance is standardized as 431 3¼ switch points. Derail. The derail consists essentially of split switch point in which necessary fixtures, switch stands, the device and manual operation, switches and movable count center points. Tangent, any straightened portion of the railway alignment. It happened the movable molten steel open-hearted furnace opening the tap hole, allowing the metal to run in the ladle. All the pouring of the molten steel is the ladle in the ingot and molded. Template is used as a piece of metal and use the exact size and shape of the real section of the hot and reverse the shape of the fitting over the hot and the cold to checking the shape. Fishing the template is shaped in between the head of the base and the filler, using to determine whether in the rail section is separately formed in the fishing spaces. Receive the joint part tensile strength and magnet maximum tensile within the material capable of suiting a tie. Adds as tie which has been plated bearings and top made of the plain smooth passages machine design and the purpose board and tie A tie which has had holes and spikes provided in passages. Machines designated in the purpose cross the transverse member of the track structure in which the rails and spiked otherwise and fastened and provided gauge as the cushion of distributed and transmitted trusses traffic through the ballast and to the roadbed. The grooved cross ties in which had been machined and groove gauge depressions and crossing top into the ribs and the bottom of the plate may fit the tie within the sap wood and no wider than the outfoot fourth of the width of the top of the tie between 20 and 40 inches in the middle of the tie. The tie of the sapwood wider than 1/4 of the width of the tie between the two 20 and 40 inches in the middle of the tie. Slab the saw on the top and only known as the whole tie and the round tie. Substitute a tie any material other than wood in combination with any other material. The switch transverses on the track structures with no longer than the function down does the cross tie. In addition, supports a crossover and a turnout. The tie plate is the plate that interposes between the rail and other track structure as a tie. A toe of the slope, intersection of the slope within the ground surface of embankments of the plain roadbed. A tolerance is an allowable variation dimension of a requirement specified. Top ballast, any material superior character of spread over the sub-ballast between support of the track structure and distributed load and sub-ballast providing good initial drainage. Top slopage intersection section of the slope and the ground surfaces and the cuts in the plains roadbed and embankment. The track is assembly of the rails and ties fastening on which are the car and locomotives and trains. Each of the parallel tracks or yard in which they are placed and stored. Classification of one of the bodies in the classification yard and track used for clarification purposes. Connecting the two parts turnouts between the frog edge arranged in the form of continuous passage from one track underneath the extension of oblique trackage and another remote parallel trackage. Cross over the two turnouts with a track between the connection to the nearby usually parallel trackage. One tracker's departure and yard and outgoing and cars in place. Drill a track connection of the ladder track of the locomotive cars moving back, forth and switching. Hold in one body tracks in the whole yard of the track used for a whole purpose. Housing the track alongside the entering of the freight house and used for the receiving or delivering freight of the house. Interchanging a track of the cars are delivered and received in between the railways. Later in the track connecting are necessary to the body tracks of the yard laid and extended in the connection either of the end of the yard of the main trackage. Passing in the track auxiliary in the main track of the median and passing in the train same in the sliding. Repair the track of the which cars are placed on the repairs. Running in track reserved in movement and through a yard. Scale a track leading from the pacing over the track scale. A sliding track auxiliary main track of the purpose other than meeting and passing in the trains. One of the body of the track acts as sorting the yard of the track and sorting purposes. A stub track and diverging the mean of the other tracks. Storage and on one body tracks and storage of yards other than tracks and storing equipment. Track connected either another one and the only in the track only in the which the cars placed and transfer the freight between the cars and highway vehicles. Y. The triangle agreement of the tracks in which locomotives and trains may be turned. Track bolts which bolt and head over the elliptical neck of threaded out and designated fastened together rails and joint bars. Track capacity and number of cars that stand in the clear of the track. Transverse defective found in defective cars. Tentative group of classifications applied prior to the breaking of the rails. All the types of defects in which they have transverse components such as transverse fissures TF, compound fissures CF, and detailed fissures DF. Transfer figures and progressive classwise fissure fracture structure starting from a crystalline center of the nucleus inside the head and spreading outward at the smoothing bright and dark round overall surface substantial the right angle the length of the rail. Distinguishing features of the transverse fissures of other types of fractures. Defective crystalline in the center of the nucleus nearly smooth of the surface development of the surrounds it. The tread of the swap surface head of the rail which is in the context of the wheel. The arrangement of the switch and the trog wheel closure means of which in rolling stocks may be diverted from one track to another. Equilateral turnout in which diversion due to an angle and turnout is divided equal between the two tracks. Lateral turnout and the diversion angle of the turnout entirely one side of the track for the turnout is made. Turnout number is in the corresponding frog number and the frog used in the turnout. B. A vertical split head, a split along near the middle of the head of this, extending to and through the rack and rusted must be shown in the head close of the web and may be split off in the head. Wasted spell blanks outside the road formed for the waist welded rail, two or more rails welded together to make a length of more than 400 feet. C is continuous weld, CWR. Wing fences, fence connecting to the apron and stack guarded to the right of way of the line facing wing wall, an extension of a abutment wall to retain adjacent earth. A wood trestle is a wood structurally composed of the bennets supporting stringers whose forming the support of loads applied to the stringers through the direct deck, whether wrought into in iron and ferrous materials, aggregated and solidified mass of paste is particularly highly refined medical or highly refined metallic iron, which is thought without subsequent fusion is incorporated in minute and uniform distributed quantity as a slag. Y is triangular, angular, and track is which is locomotive. Cars and train must be turned. Yard is system and track was defined and limits is provided by making up trains, storing cars, and other purposes over than which a movements authorized in the timetable. Train order may be subject to prescribed signals and rules and special instructions. Capacity standing the sum of the capacity of all tracks of the yard in which cars may be permitted to stand. Classification yard, which are they classified, grouped in accordance with requirements. Department of the yard of the cars assembled for the train and forwarding, holding the yard, temporary holding in the cars, receiving yard of the receiving, storage and yard of the idle equipment, and held in waiting dispositions. Appendix D.